Well, finally got around to making that YouTube channel I've been threatening to make to teach my dad how to cook. See, my mom passed away a little while ago, and my father, while he knows how to build kitchens, doesn't know a darn thing about what to do when you're in a kitchen. So, since I have been cooking for the better part of 4 decades plus, started when I was like 5 or 6 years old. I used to go shopping with my mom and used to help her in the kitchen. I remember sifting flour for her with one of those pretty useless Tupperware things that look like an hourglass, and you sit there and you spin, and you could do about a quarter cup of flour every 3 weeks. And so that's where I started. When my mom went back to work, when my brother went to college, I was in just starting high school. I started actually cooking for the family, and so I cooked many meals all through college. There I learned a lot, because going to school in Washington, D.C., I learned a lot from people of other cultures. So I learned how to cook Chinese food, learned how to cook Japanese food, learned how to cook French food, learned how to cook Spanish food. Learned how to cook a whole bunch of things from a whole bunch of different Middle Eastern food, you name it. And one thing I learned is that if you can make it in a restaurant, you pretty much can make it at home. You have to know basically what you're doing, which is what we're going to do here. We're not going to be doing recipes. The problem I have with many cooking shows is that they're just based on a recipe. Okay, so it's like, okay, throw this in the pot, do this, do that, shove it in the oven, and when an hour and a half later it comes out, and but the question is, why did you do any of that? Why are you cooking this one longer than you would that? Why are you getting it to a precise temperature? How come I have to get that oil to 375 degrees? Why are we doing these things? And if once you learn that, then you can make just about anything, okay? So you start off with, okay, what is cooking? Did you know we are the only species on Earth that cooks our food? It's one of the things that differentiates us from all the life forms on Earth. But what is it that we're actually doing when we cook? Well, there are many foods that you don't have to cook, you'll see, but we do cooking. Cooking is the preparation of food through the careful variation in temperature. That's a very specific definition. Let's go over it just really quick. It is the preparation, okay? So we're actually going to be doing something to the food. As I said, there's lots of food that doesn't require cooking. You go and you pick an apple off a tree, and then you eat it. You don't need to cook it. You can, but you don't need to. So that is not an example of cooking, because you're not preparing it. You're preparing food, right? There's lots of things that you can do in the kitchen that have nothing to do with food. We used to make these little things called shrinky dinks, which were bits of plastic that you cut up in different shapes, and then you put it in the oven, and it shrunk and got hard and stuff. But so you're using the kitchen, you're using the oven, but you're not cooking anything, because you're not making food. So it's the preparation of food through the careful, in other words, knowledgeable. You have some idea. You don't just throw a hunk of meat on a open fire and, hope it gets done right. You have to have some knowledge of what you're doing, and you have to carefully apply variations in temperature, not just heat. That's a misconception. For instance, when you make ice cream, you are technically cooking, and what you're doing is you're varying the temperature. You're making it colder to cook it. Okay? So you don't necessarily have to use heat. There are very, very different ways to vary temperature. You can use an oven, you can use a stovetop. There is a dish from South America, I believe it's Colombia, called sotaviche, and it is you take shrimp or some other sort of fish. The Norwegians do something similar, and you salt it. You use salt to actually cook it. The salt slightly varies the temperature and cooks the food. So So you can use chemical means. You can use an open fire. There's a number of ways to vary temperature, including a freezer, and that is what we use for cooking. And that brings to mind, okay, what is actually the levels of cooking? You know, I mean, there's necessity. Level number one would just be necessity, and that is, you know, opening a can of beans and sticking it on a fire and, you know, warming it up. That is, you know, old hobo food, just because we have to eat. There are some cultures that use some what we would consider unusual ingredients. For instance, in Zambia, the primary protein in their diet is a grub worm about that big that it burrows underneath tree bark, and they go out and they harvest these things and they cook them up and eat them. You'd be surprised what you put in your mouth when you're hungry. But it also happens to be very plentiful there, so that's what they eat. So it's there. You can cook a lot of things. If it has protein or some sort of vegetable matter, you can pretty much cook it. And sometimes we just cook and eat out of necessity. Then you get up to the second level, and that is when you basically become a cook. A cook is someone who is competent to be able to follow a recipe and rather consistently make a decent product that tastes good. But you're not really doing any variation on that. You're following someone else's recipe. When you get to the art of cooking, you're doing perhaps the highest form that you can in the kitchen. And cooking is an art form. It is the only art form that appeals to all five senses. There is, for instance, the first introduction to most of our food is smell. The way that something, you know, you walk in from a winter's day and you smell a nice hot pot of soup cooking, or some red gravy, or you smell onions and bacon cooking. I mean, it's one of the things that actually triggers our hunger response is the sense of smell. We know food is around when we smell it. The next would be visual, the way that things look. We like to have things that are colorful and look appetizing. You see in these old films where they'll take, you know, they're in prison or something, and you take a big spoonful of slop and drop it on a plate, and you can't even really identify it. It doesn't look very appetizing, and that's part of the point of that scene. So we want things that look good, that look appetizing. There's the way that food sounds. When a steak hits the pan and it sizzles, or when it comes on your plate and you hear that sizzling, you know it just came out of the broiler, which is actually not the best time to serve steak. Steak should not be sizzling when it comes to your table. We'll go over that. Then, and the way that, like, for instance, potato chips crack and you can tell that they're crisp. That makes them good. If they just sort of bend and go, ugh, then you know that potato chip isn't going to probably taste good. So you're looking for the way that, you know, things snap or crackle. I can tell a boiling pot just by the way that it sounds. So you are engaging your sense of hearing when you do that. Then there is the texture of food. The creaminess of ice cream, the crispiness of potato chips, the way that a steak feels when it's chewing in your mouth. So primarily the senses of texture comes through in your mouth, but it also is the way that sometimes things feel with finger food, the softness of bread, etc. So you're engaging your sense of feeling, of how things feel. And then, of course, the way things taste. That's what it's all about. It's, you know, what tastes good. So that is the highest form of cooking. That's when you reach the chef stage. And we hope to be able to get Dad somewhere between the competent stage and the chef stage. That's really where we would like to land. And so I'm going to teach you why things work the way they do in the kitchen. So what's involved in actually doing all this? Well, there are three things that areas of knowledge that you have to begin to master if you're going to be a decent cook or chef in the kitchen. One is you've got to know what tools at your disposal. I'm going to presume that you know nothing, because I know my dad knows nothing about the kitchen. So we're going to start with, what is a knife? All right, so you have knives, you have various instruments of destruction, spoons, forks, etc. You have pots and pans. So what's the difference between a saucier and a sautoir? Then you have gadgets. There's all kinds of gadgets in the world. So we'll go over those three basic broad categories of what these instruments and what these tools are. The second is you got to know your ingredients. What makes one cut of meat, like why do you have to cook a chuck steak for 2 to 3 hours, but you can throw a ribeye on a grill or into a pan for 2 or 3 minutes and eat it? Aren't they both beef? Well, yeah, they are, but there are different cuts of beef, and there are ways to tell what cuts you have to cook what way. And that leads to the third important part of cooking, which is really important, which, again, cooking shows never really address. That's technique. Why do we do certain things to certain foods? Why do we cut it this way as opposed to that way? Why do we put it at this temperature instead of that temperature? How can we cook it this long instead of this long? Though all those things are why questions. Why are we doing this? And that's what I really want to try to get across in what we're doing. So we will be cooking food and we will be using recipes, but along the way I'm going to try to explain why the chef, whoever it was, put this into their recipe instead of that. We'll even do some of my blue ribbon recipes that are actually posted online. So I've been experimenting for years and done this, so kind of have an idea of what it is I'm talking about, and I want to try to impart that idea principally to my dad, but anybody else from around the world who wants to chime in and check out these videos, you're more than welcome to, and I hope it's profitable and helps you become a better cook.